Good evening. Welcome to the First Friday Show. I'm Mililani Trask, and I'll be your hostess for this August 2012 edition of First Friday, the Unauthorized News. If you're calling in tonight, and it is the first Friday in August 2012, then you're watching a live show. Give us a call with your comments or your questions. The number is 834-2886. 834-2886. Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at the Bishop Estate trustee selection process and some other problems that have been occurring at the Bishop Estate that have not really come to light. Joining me tonight, my regular commentator, Professor Manu Kaiama from the Center for Hawaiian Studies. Welcome to the show.
Aloha.
And also, welcoming back to the First Friday Show, Naiwi Wurdeman, Hawaiian attorney, and also good friend, joining us tonight to talk about the Bishop Estate. Thanks for coming on, Naiwi.
Aloha, Mililani. Manu.
Before we get to our show, though, we'll be taking a look at a couple of unauthorized news pieces, beginning first with some good news from the state legislature.
Yes, on July 9th, Abercrombie signed into law legislation that created the Ahamoku Advisory Committee, and this advisory committee is going to be home-based in the Department of Land and Natural Resources. I thought really interesting, I took a look at the bill that got approved for an act, and Section 1 starts with the legislature finds that over the past 200 years, Hawaii has experienced extensive changes. These changes include the deterioration of the Hawaiian culture, language, values, and land tenure system, which have in part resulted in the overdevelopment of the coastline, alteration of fresh water streams, destruction of life-giving watersheds, decimation of the coral reefs, and the decline of endemic marine and terrestrial species. So when you start, a law like that, it's quite powerful. The interesting thing about this is this law is actually the result of a number of puvalu that were held from 2006 to about 2010. Yeah. And these puvalu included kanaka maoli who were practitioners. So we were looking at having fishermen come, farmers come, Hawaiian experts in many of the areas that do their kuleana with the land and with the ocean. So after these puvalus, they started to meet to discuss about traditional methodologies used to protect, sustain, and nurture all of our natural environments and our natural resources. And later, they also met with stakeholders, policymakers, environmental groups. So it was actually a series of steps that they went through in these puvalu. And finally, after these meetings, there seemed to be a consensus that there was a definite need to integrate the Ahamoku system into government-making policy. Mm-hmm. The committee that we now have, thanks to this law, will consist of 8 members, and each member will represent one of our islands. What's nice about it is that the Ahamoku for each island council will put forward some names, and then Abercrombie will choose from those names rather than whoever is the governor at the time, just choosing someone off the top of his head. So that's also nice. The Ahamoku recognizes that for 10 centuries, we, Kanaka Maoli, our system of natural resource management based upon the Ahupua'a exemplifies best practices. And finally, we're going to have some say, some advisory capacity now in the government level. Any comments on this, Millie? Because you were involved in some of this, weren't you?
Yeah, I'm really happy to see this finally become law. It's been 6 years, right. And what's been so interesting about this effort is that there's been solid support from the state legislature, House and Senate. Year after year, this measure has come up with 100% voting yes. There's not been, the last, I think, 3 years, there was not a single vote in the House or Senate opposing this measure. Last year it got passed, but it got passed as a body that would be advising the governor. Then it sparked a great controversy because every other group wanted to be advising the governor.
Right.
What happened this year was that an adjustment was made to bring the traditional practitioners and knowledge holders in to work with the DLNR. because it's the DLNR that manages forests, that looks at marine fisheries, the inshore areas, all of these kinds of concerns. But for the aha moku, what it means is that the state recognizes the value of the traditional cultural knowledge of the Hawaiian people. And now in our state, when we look at managing lands or forests or streams, we'll be able to take, hopefully, a more appropriate cultural perspective. And for us, it's a very good thing, because we know now that those who have been, for instance, the taro task force and those that have worked with taro, at one time it was believed that the taro species had all been lost. Now they are being found, and they're coming back because the practitioners have protected them and kept them all these years. But I think that, you know, we really got to take our hats off to this aha moku group. 6 years in the legislature, they showed they could do it. And of course, their fearless female leader, Leimana Kineti Mate, who I think has really worked overtime. All the native practitioners, those who have come from all the islands, and even with oversight for Koho'olave, coming from our kupuna Uncle Les Kuloloyo from Maui, no island has been left out. So even the knowledge of those who know Koho'olave will now be included. It was just a real big win for everyone. And I'm looking forward to seeing how we can get the aha moku recognized by our state now to participate in a meaningful way in the resource management for the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. They've been systematically shut out, but hopefully now this will be the authority they need to move forward.
Yep.
It was a big win for everyone.
Absolutely.
For those of you who are OHA watchers, take a look at your next Kauai Ola newsletter. You know, every month it comes out, and there's articles written by all of the trustees. But this month, you're not going to see an article written by Trustee Roena Akana, and that's why I think everyone should read the article, because she's trying to tell you why she can't write the article she did write. Apparently, Trustee Roena Akana has filed an ethics complaint against Trustee Haunani Apoliona. This relates to a vote that was taken to purchase a property. I understand it's over $20 million, but this is even a stranger story. A few months ago, the OHA agenda listed under executive session a discussion relating to a piece of property. But it didn't say where the property was. It didn't say how much of the property was being looked at to purchase. It didn't say the value, and it didn't say why OHA was purchasing property in Honolulu town when OHA had just picked up a huge parcel of property as a result of the settlement. Well, slowly, rumors began to shift out of OHA that, in fact, it was a special deal being put together by Ozzie Stender to pay over $20 million for land that they needed for an office. This I don't understand, given the fact that they just got through going throughout the state telling everyone we needed the settlement so they could have the land for the office. Apparently, the item was taken only in executive session so that the beneficiaries and the public wouldn't know who was selling the land, wouldn't know what condition the land was in, wouldn't know if there was any appraisal ever made. And I'm a stickler on this for Stender, because 2 years ago he tried to push through a $200 million settlement without a single appraisal. However, it now appears that a deal somehow was pushed through, and the deal is going to be handled by First Hawaiian Bank. First Hawaiian Bank has a board, and sitting on that board is Haunani Apoliona, who is supposed to notify the trustees of her conflict and refrain from voting. Unfortunately, she did not do that, and now an ethics complaint has been filed against her by Trustee Akana, but they won't make it public, and it appears that the reason why is because they're concerned that it might have a negative impact on Trustee Apoliona's effort to be reelected. Bad move for OHA, and I'm not really sure what the trustees are doing up there, but whenever you have an ethics complaint filed, especially against an elected official, during a time of an election period, these details should have been made public. It has to leave me wondering, you know, exactly what was this vote taken for? How many millions of our trust dollars are going to be put through First Hawaiian? And if First Hawaiian is handling it, then for goodness sakes, their board members shouldn't be voting on it. If in fact this has occurred, and Trustee Apoliona did vote on it, then I think we only have one choice left. First Hawaiian Bank really should not be handling this transaction. They're in a conflict. And if the trustee can't be upfront enough or honest enough to put that on the record, then that means that First Hawaiian Bank is conflicted out. They should not be handling this sale, and we'll have to keep an eye on it in the future. But now let's take a look at, I think, a more important story, and a story that First Friday has actually covered many times over the last 16 years that we've been on the air, and that is the story of the Bishop Estate, how they're selecting their trustees, and what's really happening there. Joining us tonight, a special guest and a special friend, Hawaiian attorney Naiwi Wurdeman, who has been on the show before, and who actually has been on the show to talk not only about issues such as this, but also about the Okaka Bill when you were serving as the chair of the Native Hawaiian Bar Association. Welcome to the show, Naiwi.
Thank you, and good evening, Mililani and Manu. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, welcome back. We haven't seen you for a few years. You know, because you haven't been here, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and your family?
I'm a Kamehameha School's graduate class of 1983. My mother, Ginger Kahapea, the former Ginger Kahapea, was the class of 1959 at Kamehameha. My dad went to the rivalry of Kalaipohaku at St. Louis, class of 55. And my wife, Tehani Waine'e, now of course Wurdeman, was class of 1985 at Kamehameha. So we have a strong tie and connection with the schools, and it's such a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about this important topic. The last time I was here, I remember one of the critical issues that we talked about that evening, it was about 3 years ago, was the ceded lands case that went up to the United States Supreme Court. And at that time, Governor Lingo and her Attorney General at that time, Mark Bennett, insisted on challenging Native Hawaiian title to the ceded lands trust. And that was a very, very critical point and an issue at that time, and still is, of course. And it's so nice to be here on this new important topic. I am an attorney practicing here in Honolulu. I practice in areas of civil litigation, land litigation, also land use matters, Native Hawaiian right issues, and also represent various unions in some of the labor issues.
But also your practice is a statewide practice, even though your office is here, because I know you have clients right now on the Big Island?
That is correct. And I often fly to the neighbor islands to help out some of the Native Hawaiian people out there who are frustrated with the legal system and you know, try to assist them with some of their problems.
Well, you know, I'm glad to have you on the show. About a year ago, we had Benny Medina to come and talk about this. But I think that the business of the Bishop Estate, the care, the oversight of the Bishop Estate is something that's important to all of us. And it should be important to everyone in the state, whether you're Hawaiian or not, or you're a graduate, alum, or have a child there, because the Bishop Estate is such a huge power, landowner, and a huge influence politically. But the processes that impact the Bishop Estate are not private processes. They are, in fact, processes that involve our court system because of the obligations arising under the will of Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop. And I'm wondering, Manu, if you can give us, to start off, a little bit of an overview of what the processes are for trustee selection.
Sure. I did go back. I wasn't able to be at the show that that Benson Medina was here. So I took a look at that show, and I got a synopsis from all of the work that he has done in looking at the different processes over the years. And basically we know that it was first determined by the will of our princess, Bernice, how to select trustees. And she basically said that, you know, she would direct that the highest court of the land would be the organization or the group that would choose the trustees. Now we have to remember that our princess died in 1884. So when she wrote her will, we still had the nation of Hawaii, and she was thinking about that court, not thinking about an American Supreme Court. So that happened, and she had appointed the first 5 trustees as her husband and some of his friends, and then she passed. So in a few years later, in 1887, Kamehameha schools, at least the boys' school, got started. And at this time, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't that controversial. Kamehameha was land rich and cash poor, so they didn't have the kind of liquidity and the kind of opportunities and challenges that we see them faced with today. 25 years later, it was really neat because Benny had said, okay, then the alumni came back to the school and said, you know, we don't want this to just be a school that is about vocational training, but we want this to be college prep. So Kamehameha schools listened to the alumni, and they started to instill different programs to help with college preparatory. And then probably about 50 years had gone by since the beginning, and trustees at that time still served with little or no compensation. So this was just an act of love for Bernice Pauahi's wishes. And then he dropped some names which I thought were very interesting. The first Hawaiian and alum of Kamehameha schools who became a trustee was Edwin Murray, and that was in 1940. And the second one after that, you might not remember, but I know I do, was Papa Lyman in the 1960s. And so then the 1960s come along, and about 1967 we have some leasehold conversion activity in the courts. And what this basically did was force Kamehameha to sell some of their leasehold properties in fee to the people who were residing on them, and that ended up manifesting an infusion of cash to Kamehameha schools operations. And when that happened, well, at that time the Supreme Court of Hawaii was making the choices of the next trustees. So what ended up happening because of this was you know, it really wasn't just, excuse me, let me back up. It wasn't just the Supreme Court, but the governor at the time who appointed the Supreme Court would give them a name, and then they would pretty much rubber stamp it or say okay. So it began to become a very political activity because the governor's looking for someone, and here the school is now doing quite well. They're very liquid. So the Kamehameha Schools trustee position became kind of a feather in your cap. And we started to see it being politicized, especially when Matsuo Takabuki, during that era of Pinky Thompson, around 1971, they started to look like political payoffs rather than people being chosen because of their background, because of their desire, their passion to do well by the Kamehameha schools.
Yes.
Correct. And by now it was interesting because the trustees were using a statutory formula to go ahead and determine their compensation. And what they did was they really aren't, by law, they're not supposed to make more money than the services that they render deserve. So what they started to do was they did research and said, yeah, but if you have a for-profit company that's handling this kind of asset base and this much money, these for-profit corporations make this, you know, the CEOs, the board of director members make this much money. So it was, they were able to bump up their amount that they got recognized that they should be paid or should be recognized as being paid. Mm-hmm. Since trustees' compensation was tied to the estate's profits, okay, trustees were seen more as trying to increase the portfolio to line their own pockets rather than take care of the schools. And I think we were all in school at around that time, that turn of that tide. So this is seen why they didn't use their obvious influence to fight the forced leasehold conversion when it occurred again in 1984. So this is kind of seen as a reason why they didn't do that, you know.
Sure.
Because it would work against them when you're
Yes.
looking at their compensation.
They would make more money.
Right, right. So bring it a little current. In the mid-1990s, the IRS got involved. They threatened to actually revoke the not-for-profit status of Kamehameha when they look at what was going on. They said that, you know, you need to be taking care of these schools, you need to be supporting the mission of the will and what was stated, and really gave Kamehameha, or the trustees at that time, a big shot in the arm. So they started to plan to build campuses on other islands, all the things that we, for many years, many Hawaiians have said, how come there isn't a Kamehameha schools on Kauai or Maui or Hawaii Island? And so they started to do that. And then along comes Lokilani Lindsay and the rest of the gang. They received a lot of harsh criticism for their leadership style. The Broken Trust was published in the newspaper, and that also called for a lot of accountability regarding the trustees and their actions. Courts then decided that this bunch of trustees were remiss, in their fiduciary duties to the school. They were just trying to build wealth for themselves, and they probably didn't have the type of experience necessary to be running a billion-dollar estate. Trust estate, excuse me. And so they took them out and they put in interim trustees, and at that time in 1999 a new criterion was placed by the interim trustees saying, okay, we want to make this process as transparent as we can. And that criterion included, of course, following the princess's wishes that trustees be Protestant faith, hold no political office 5 years before becoming a trustee, and that the committee that would be charged with choosing 6 names, which would then be vetted to 3, that committee should be chosen of 7 people representative of the Kamehameha Ohana, and they should have some experience in broad trusts. All right, so excuse me, but that brings us current for today, and that's where we are. We basically have a trustee selection committee. It's made up of 7 people, 7 members. We also have a probate judge, and then we have a current court master. So this is where we are today, and now we're looking at the trustees that have been put into position in the last few years and the ones that are coming up for possibility and consideration.
You know, I think when we go back and look at the history of what happened with the Bishop Estate, you know, there's always been a problem with political influence, and I think it was at its worst when the Supreme Court judges were making the choice. But the idea through all the controversial years was to try to structure a new process so that we would remove both the selection committee as well as the review of the estate business from the political arena. This was supposed to be accomplished through the appointment of master, as well as the probate judge selecting the 7 who would be the trustee selection committee. How do you think this has worked out, Naiwi? I mean, you're a Bishop Estate watcher and you've been involved, I know. But what do you think about the new process? And I got to say, I'm shocked now to look at the names, same names as last time.
Yes, and just to go back on some of the issues that Manu had pointed out on the history of the selection process. Of course, in the will itself, Bernice Boahi's will, she gave that authority to the 5 justices of the Supreme Court. And as Manu appropriately pointed out earlier, at that time, of course, it was the Court of the Kingdom of Hawaii. But that is what her will stated,
yes,
or states. And what has happened, of course, and Manu also talked about the Land Reform Act and the forced sale of Kamehameha lands, the fee simple interest in Kamehameha lands, and this whole turn of events in which the trustees then were getting compensated by huge commissions of $800,000 a year plus in serving as trustees. That whole issue you have all this money, and it's now a very politically plumb position, and we saw how that played out in the 80s and the 90s. What happened was, and interestingly, I mean, the selection by the Supreme Court occurred for almost 100 years without this kind of controversy that really started to take place in the 1980s following the Land Reform Act. But what happened was, after some controversial selections, the first actual blue ribbon selection committee that was put together was in 1993, 1994, right in that area. And at that time, the sitting Supreme Court was already getting criticized for some of the former politicians who were then sitting as trustees making all of this money. So this Blue Ribbon Committee really seemed a way to try to insulate some of the controversy, have this group of what was made up of people that were well recognized in the community. And what happened was, and we learned this through all the Broken Trust articles and all the other articles that were written at the time, was that after the committee had selected the 5 finalists for the one vacancy in 1993, 1994, the Supreme Court then apparently said, we don't see the name that we really want on that list, so they disbanded the selection committee, and then they added their own names, and the final trustee who was selected, who with the other 4 who were sitting at that time, that were eventually all removed for their breaches of trust, was Gerard Jervis. And so that was the beginning of the selection committee process. And it was then revived in 1999 after the removal of the trustees, when we had interim trustees who took over. And the master at that time put together a recommendation to the court that, as Manu described, there should be 7 members of that committee who are selected by the probate court, who would serve as a blue ribbon committee. And moving back, during that whole removal process, also what happened was the Supreme Court, in a 4-to-1 vote, Justice Klein at that time decided that he wanted to continue to have the Supreme Court justices select the trustees as was set forth in Pauahi's will. But what happened was the Supreme Court, after all of this controversy, said that we're not going to select trustees any longer, and they then put that authority in the hands of the probate judge. And so it went from 5 Supreme Court justices to 1 sitting probate court judge in the circuit court. And so that's a lot of pressure for one individual, going from 5 justices on the highest court to 1 judge sitting in a lower court, in a probate court. And so at that time, the trustee selection committee was set up by the master, and it's been a process that's been followed ever since. And so that's kind of how the whole trustee selection process has developed.
You know, and just to comment on that, because I did talk to some legal counsel at Kamehameha Schools, and they said that the committee is selected by the probate judge.
Yes.
Yeah, not by the court master. And I think that's really interesting for our people at home to know, because everyone's thinking that the court master this is their kuleana, but it's actually the probate judge who chose the committee and has the ability to, they don't have an application process. The probate judge can choose whomever they want. And if they say yes, they're on, and they can. The only times they've had people leave is by resigning, never because they were asked to leave or because their term limit was up.
Well, if there's no application process for people who feel that they should be on the selection committee, how are the people identified?
You got to know the judge.
What happened?
You have to know the judge.
What happened was, following the recommendations of the master at that time to set up this process, the probate court judge did select 7 committee members. And for the most part, those committee members have been the same committee members who have served every year for the last 10 years or so. And except for a few exceptions, as Manu stated, when certain members stepped down for whatever reason, they were then replaced by the probate court, the probate judge, to fill that vacancy. But there's always been those 7 people sitting on the trustee selection committee.
Well, I think the thing is that when I look at the selection committee now, when I look at the process, you have a probate judge. He's appointing a master, and he's appointing a trustee selection committee. What are the criterion for people to be on the trustee selection committee? Well, you know, there really isn't an application process that you could weigh criteria on. You know what I'm saying? When I looked at the process, I mean, we've just been through a situation the last time around. Over 80 applications were submitted. 3 names came forward: Aulani Wilhelm, Tony Krucky, and Lance Wilhelm, who eventually was given the position. Lance Wilhelm is now a trustee. Now we have a totally new vacancy that comes up. We have at least 70 applications from what I understand, and the same 2 out of the 3 names come back. And one of them I know for a fact, Aulani Wilhelm, really has no qualification. But when I look at this, I see that, in fact, it's the same trustee selection committee that's sending 2 out of the same 3 names up. And it's occurring during a period of time where, I mean, I have to say, I heard about it in the community. It was common knowledge. The court was looking for a new master. This has been going on for the last few months. Initially, I had heard that the court wanted to change a master. He was looking to appoint someone else. Then I heard that the court was considering several names. Then I heard in the community that a name had been chosen, but no new master was actually appointed. We're still having the same old master, Mr. David Fairbanks. Did you hear this?
I'm not, I know that since the commencement of the, or since the controversies with the former trustees, there's only been 3 masters who have served. Colbert Matsumoto at the time was the master who
many years.
Was very instrumental and actually wrote some very thorough reports at the time during the removal of the trustee process. He was followed by Ben Matsubara, who interestingly now sits as one of the members of the trustee selection committee. And Mr. Matsubara was then replaced by Mr. Fairbanks, who has served for roughly 6 to 8 years as the master for the probate court. And what the master is, it's really the eyes and ears for the probate court judge. The probate court judge can't go out in the community and do all the research independently. That judge has to be able to rely on a good master to bring the information of problems at Kamehameha schools to the probate court so that the probate court
That's
can
right.
then
In
act on
fact,
it.
one of the biggest obligations of the master is to appraise the probate court of how business is being conducted at the schools, but also problematic areas. And, you know, when I looked at some of the past problems that have come up, for instance, the sale of the Bishop Estate Kaka'ako land, which was very valuable land. We know that Kaka'ako is an area that right now is the prime area for development in Honolulu. Here's an excellent piece of property, belongs to the estate. For goodness sakes, why did the estate agree to sell that property to A&B? And where was the master on looking at that? That was an asset, you know, that should have been preserved, I think. But there's something that you have to question. The master's report did not really look at that.
Yes, and that sale actually just took place earlier this year.
Yes.
In February, I guess, is when they actually closed the deal.
Yes.
And what that parcel was the former CompUSA site in Kaka'ako. And what the plan was or is that Alexander and Baldwin is going to build this supposed high-rise luxury
Yes.
residential condominium. And then Kamehameha Schools will build a big retail center around that condominium, which will certainly benefit Alexander and Baldwin's development. So that, from what I understand, is basically how the deal worked. The selling of land, of course, is what you have to do first is look to the will itself. And Puahi, when she set forth the will, although she gave the trustees powers to sell and lease, she limited it by saying, really, when it was only absolutely necessary for the operation of the schools or for the best interest of her estate. So there's that built-in restriction, if you may, that Puahi put in her own will on the sale. Kaka'ako is owned primarily or to a great extent by Kamehameha Schools, and as we all know in talking about earlier comments about OHA and its activity down in the Kaka'ako area, that really is the hotbed of real estate development probably in the next 10 or 20 years.
It really is. And, you know, I mean, just as an attorney, if we weren't looking at the Kamehameha Schools, you see parcels like Kaka'ako. We know the value of it. Now, here's a situation where the Bishop Estate really could have looked at both opportunities, luxury condo as well as commercial area to support it. I understand the deal that you laid out, and that's pretty much what everybody heard in town. But what I didn't understand was why the estate itself wouldn't have taken the first opportunity to do the luxury development, to do the commercial development, and have both. The Bishop Estate has background in developing both types of property. It has experience. Why it wasn't done, I don't know, and why the master did not point this out as being a problematic area for the court, I also don't know. But to me, there should have been more, a little more scrutiny on that deal.
That's true, and certainly if this current master is going to continue, that is something that he's going to really have to explore further, or whomever replaces this master, explore further to make sure, hold the trustees accountable for their actions. They have to follow the will. They have trust, legal responsibilities that they have to follow, duty of loyalty to the beneficiaries. First and foremost, solely their loyalty is to the beneficiaries, not to any other business interests out there that they may have connections to. And so in talking about earlier, you had mentioned First Hawaiian Bank, for example, and some of the conflicts. And if you look at some of the directors who are involved with First Hawaiian Bank and Alexander and Baldwin, you also see some connections to some of the Kamehameha School trustees. So that's really a very great issue of great concern, and something that the trustee and also the Native Hawaiian community really needs to start talking about and raise and put some pressure on this.
Right. I think if we're looking at this, one of the problems that we had are the concerns because of the process. When we were looking at the process and trying to find out information, you know, I called Kamehameha, I talked to people, and they were very open. They're not a part of the process, so they told me what they could tell me because they try not to be a part of that trustee selection process. I also actually spoke to one of the committee members, and she was very forthcoming. She wanted to help us and let us understand the process. So I think that's really important. I also have had the opportunity to work with the two newer trustees in some capacity. So Lance Wilhelm, for example, I find him to be bright. He seems to know his stuff. He's interestingly connected, construction industry and union. You probably know more than I do. But for some reason, Kamehameha, when they're thinking about putting people together on this board, they aren't thinking as traditionally as we used to think, what type of people you should have on this board. You should have a lawyer, you should have a CPA, you should have an educator. They don't have that mix anymore like they used to. And also, they're not waiting for people to get a little older and a little more wiser with a lot of experience. They're looking at putting much younger trustees there. I also had the opportunity to work with Janine Olds, and I found her very competent. So I think this is interesting. I think the worry, though, that was expressed to us in different community gatherings that we have happened to be in, and people come and talk to us, no matter where it is that the idea of recycling names seems to give an appearance of lack of interest or lack of due diligence, or someone's not working hard, because why are we recycling names through this process? Aren't there talented people out there that haven't been considered yet? So I think that's sort of an issue that has come to our attention as we're looking at the different names.
Yes. And with respect to that, and I failed to talk about earlier, was that the selection committee itself, it takes those 75 names that Mililani talked about, and it then narrows it down to 6 people who they then give interviews to. They then narrow that list of 6 down to 3, and they send those 3 names to the probate judge. So the probate court is really disconnected from that whole process until it receives just those 3 names. So what happens is, if your selection committee fails and is not sending the best names over to the probate court, then the probate court has its hand tied in this process, because it has to pick from just those 3 names that are sent to it. And of course, 2 of the 3 names who were on the list last year and who the judge already decided last year he wasn't going to select are once again finalists for this newest vacancy.
Right, and that is Tony Krucky and Aulani Wilhelm. But when I look at the process, you hear that we're going to be getting a new master. Everyone is waiting to hear. The old master is obviously accepting that he's on his way out. A new master is then proposed, but is in a conflict of interest. It really looks like what actually happened here was nobody really did anything. The selection committee that's been there for years came out with their recommendations. A new master was anticipated to be appointed, but never came forward. So we had the same old people, and what they did basically was send up the same old list. One new name was added, which is Robert Nobriga, a young fellow that has an accounting background, but no background really in education, no real background in investment, portfolio management, land development. The last time around, I was very impressed with Tony Krucky, because he did have a very interesting background. There's no doubt that he's brilliant. He knows about fundraising and has raised significant funds himself in terms of his own genetic research. But all things being equal, Lance Wilhelm, being a graduate, had an additional support, and that is actually part of the criteria that can be considered by the selection committee. But I think what we have now is we have a group of people who have been selected. They don't have any particular criteria. The selection committee, what is their criteria? Did they apply? Who reviews it? And is there any kind of public input that can be given? And it does not look like there is any at all. You have the very same people. So if they're approached, if they are impacted politically in the first round, they would remain to make that selection a second time. When we had talked about preparing for the show, one of the things we talked about was of strengthening the process by having a new trustee selection committee for each nomination. That way, you don't have people on the trustee selection committee saying, sure, we'll help you out, Auntie Laura Thompson and Nainoa and Stender, by pushing in Aulani's name again. You wouldn't have that if you had a new selection committee that came up each time. And I think we also should look at the involvement of Hawaiians and criteria that would include cultural criteria. I think we should have some Kamehameha alums involved in this.
It does appear, I mean, it just has an appearance of being stagnant. You know, it has an appearance of being old and not being, having the proper amount of attention applied to it, that all the graduates and all the alum and hopefully the students that are there now and the beneficiaries, and everyone's a beneficiary of Kamehameha's good work, really expect. So I think that's sort of the interesting perspective, is that it just seems like it's just sort of a tired process and this is what's happening. And I don't know if it's because people are not interested in becoming Kamehameha School trustees because the most you can make is like about $120,000, or if it's not as glamorous as it used to be. It's still a position that should hold a lot of respect in the community, that should really exemplify the powerful and the good work that Kamehameha Schools does, you know, in our Native Hawaiian communities. So
you know,
I'm
we're
not
getting
sure
some
why.
questions, and this is a good one. What is the role of Inkanen? We've talked about the probate court, the master. We have a trustee selection committee appointed by the probate court. And then we have Inkanen. What is Inkanen and what are they doing here?
Well, Inkanen and Associates is an employment headhunting firm here in Honolulu, and they've actually been involved in the process really since its inception in 1999, as we talked about earlier. Inkanen is paid by the estate to assist the selection committee. So Kathy Inkanen, who's the president, is supposed to, her and her staff, gather all the information, the applications, the 70 or 75 that are submitted every year, and then submit that to the selection committee for its review. So her job is to help facilitate the selection committee, is my understanding.
And my understanding is that Inkanen does really have a job to do, and their job is that they receive applications and they have to verify what is represented in the application. So if someone says, I've done this or I've done that, they have to go back and check that that's the criteria. We have another question here for both yourself and myself. Manu, didn't we sign a letter to the probate court not too long ago asking the court to support the appointment of a woman? And if that is the case, why are we not supporting Aulani Wilhelm?
You probably could answer that better than me, because I've never come out publicly not supporting Aulani. I haven't had the one-on-one dealings that you have had with her, with the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. But that is true, that caller is true. We did sign a number of us women,
yes, several
signed
women,
and
yes,
said, you know, we want to see a woman. And since then, they have put Janine Olds on, because I believe that letter went in before Janine was put on as a trustee. And we're of course, we're interested in forwarding a Hawaiian woman, but we're also very interested in forwarding qualified Hawaiian women. So.
No, I completely agree with you. The purpose of having gender equity is so that you can have balance of perspective and better qualifications. The fact that a candidate has breasts doesn't mean that they should be a trustee of the Bishop Estate. It doesn't have anything to do with that, but it has to do with competency and qualifications. And when you look at Aulani Wilhelm, I mean, you have to be shocked by it. We took a look at what her qualifications were not. I think she has some kind of a degree in environmental science. But the Bishop Estate is involved with education. No background there. Aulani Wilhelm has no background in investment, finance, portfolio management. No background at all in land development, commercial, residential, or industrial. And these are the areas where the Bishop Estate has lands. And even in the area of conservation, Wilhelm's background has to do with marine and certainly not land-based. But in the last year, things have only gotten worse for Auleni Wilhelm on 2 scores. Just this past month, Manny Duamas, who led the Westpac for many years, was the chair of Westpac. He left, he ended his term, and at the conference that occurred in the last 2 months, he lambasted the Hawaii NOAA and the U.S. NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, which Auleni Wilhelm is primarily employed by and has oversight. But he blasted them and pointed out that repeatedly, all these years, every decision the U.S. NOAA has made has been against what he called brown-skinned people, a bias against brown-skinned people to ensure that they would not have their rights to the sea so that they would not be able to feed their families. And that has really raised a lot of concern in Washington, and there are people asking questions because when the chair of Westpac says a U.S. agency for years has shown a bias against brown-skinned people, it's an allegation of racism. And that is exactly the same allegation that the Aha Moku and other Hawaiians, fishermen and others raised against the Northwest Hawaiian Islands and what Auleni Wilhelm was doing. But now things have actually gone from bad to worse. If you remember a couple of years ago, the U.S. NOAA here in Hawaii hosted the United Nations Global Meeting on Marine Debris. And at that time, the U.S. NOAA in Hawaii came forward to talk about their plan. Everyone was concerned with the tsunami that had hit in Fukushima. Right. 5 million tons of debris was washing into the Pacific. Our own experts at the U of H had developed the tracking model so that they could see how the Pacific currents were going to bring the trash into the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. The global conference was hosted. Wilhelm and others talked about the great U.S. plan. That was a few years ago, but nothing was done. No plan was ever unveiled. Now we have tons of debris coming into Hawaii. It has already hit the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. It's in the monument. It's making a landfall in California. Harley-Davidson motorcycle just washed up in Canada. And what is happening? What happened to the Auleni Wilhelm plan to protect the Northwest Hawaiian Islands? Well, Congress couldn't get an answer. In May, they had a congressional hearing on it, and the U.S. NOAA went in and announced that, in fact, they never had a plan. They don't have any plan to clean up the debris. Their spokesperson, Mr. Kennedy, testified to Congress that they did not have a plan. They did not have a way to track the debris. They did have the data from the University of Hawaii showing where the debris would come and when it would hit Hawaii and how it would come into the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. But what Mr. Kennedy told the Congress was that the U.S. NOAA had been granted access to use the satellite data that the university had developed. But Kennedy said it was probable that the agency didn't know what was available or how to access it. So here we have the U of H right here in Hawaii tracking the tsunami debris going to the NOAA, but Auleni Wilhelm and her staff apparently didn't know how to read the data. You know, this is not a person who should be a trustee. Why are we even considering this name a second time? I can understand Mr. Krucky, but this I cannot understand. And when I look, I see it was the same exact trustee selection committee that pushed her name for political reasons. Now, we have a couple of questions here. What positive changes can be made to change the process?
Manu brought up a good point about, and yourself as well, about appointing new committees for each process. What's interesting, though, is that if you look at the makeup of the current selection committee, I think there's only one of the 7 who is actually a Kamehameha graduate on that committee. And there's a number of non-Hawaiians on that committee as well. And in looking at my review of the names, really, the majority of that committee has very little connection whatsoever to the schools and to Pauahi's mission. So that's where your problem really starts, is with the current makeup of the committee.
You know, I really agree with that. When I look at them, I have no idea why these 7 people were appointed. Only one has a background with the schools. The rest also do not seem to meet the criteria. How can they judge 75 applicants? Also, I have several calls I want to mention before the end of the show. Profound disappointment and anger from many corners now coming out. People cannot believe that Michael Chun's application wasn't even sent up to the court. And several people saying Chun has 24 years of working with the schools, had significant support, could not get his application sent to the judge. And of course, I think everyone knows that he was a graduate.
Did he confirm that he applied? Did he confirm that he applied, or is that an assumption? Or people are just telling you that he applied?
I'm only getting calls and also questions about it, but apparently people did send letters in.
I heard the same thing. Dr. Chun did apply and didn't even make the short list of 6, and wasn't even given a courtesy interview after his 24 years of service. And interestingly, with someone with that kind of connection to the schools, and then you end up with these 3 names that have very little connections, and for the most part lack really the necessary background and skills that's necessary for the position of trustee.
You know, I think at this point, I think it's fair to say we've had the same master in for many years. It's time for a change in the master. We need a new selection committee, but don't we also need some criteria for people to sit there so that we can ensure that they have a background? I mean, if you're sending 75 applicants to a committee of 7, shouldn't the committee of 7 themselves have a background in investment or education? And shouldn't these things be brought to the attention of the probate court? How can we do that?
Well, that's certainly the role of the master, and maybe we ought to start contacting a master and express our concerns about this whole process. But with respect to the committee, there are some basic qualifications, and one is it's a connection to the Kamehameha schools and to Pauahi, and also experience in management of large operations like Kamehameha.
As we're closing our show, what is the name of the probate judge and what is his address?
The Honorable Derek Chan, Circuit Court of the First Circuit, 777 Punchbowl Street, Honolulu 96813. I know there's a process where whatever letters regarding the finalists are supposed to go through Inkanin, but you can look that up on their website.
So I'm impressed you knew that.
You know, if you'd like to write to the probate judge, CC Inkanin, to let him know what you think, Judge Derek Chan at the Probate Court, 777 Punchbowl Street. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll be covering additional problems coming up with the Bishop Estate in the next coming months. A group of several people, myself included, had sent a letter listing concerns that we had with the estate. We're going to give them 30 more days, and then we're going to bring it out publicly.